You are standing in a bar that smells like leather and gasoline and old rain, and an 81-year-old woman is placing an envelope on the counter like it might detonate. She has done this 9 times before. She will leave before anyone learns her name. Tonight, for the first time, she does not walk through that door at all, and the man watching the clock like it owes him money will spend the rest of his life grateful that he noticed. Stay until the end. You will want to know what was in the letters. The clubhouse bar in Blackridge sat off Route 9 like a tooth that refused to fall out, its neon sign missing the R in BAR, so that from the highway it simply read BA, blinking red into the dark. Inside, 63 men and women who rode under a single patch had learned, without ever discussing it, to go quiet around 8 o'clock on December 23rd. Pool cues rested, jukebox went silent between songs, and nobody fed it more quarters. It was a kind of church nobody had built on purpose. He noticed things for a living, had noticed things since Kandahar, since the desert taught him that the man who watches the doorframe survives longer than the man who watches the room. 51 years old, gray in the beard now, a scar along his jaw from a mistake he did not talk about. Sergeant at arms of the club for 11 of those years, which mostly meant he was the one who counted heads at closing time and made sure nobody rode home who shouldn't. He had counted the widow 9 times. She always arrived at 8:04, give or take a minute, in a coat the color of a storm cloud, snow beaded on her shoulders, like she'd walked farther than anyone should walk at her age. She never sat. She placed cash on the bar, enough to cover every tab in the room, and then some, and a folded note beside it, and she was back out the door before the bartender could finish saying, "Ma'am." The note said the same thing every year, in the same careful handwriting, blue ink gone slightly gray with age. "For the boys who bring my son home safe on the roads." No one had ever asked which son. No one had ever caught her name. The delivery boy who brought firewood to the clubhouse once said she lived somewhere past the county line, out where the road narrowed, and the porch lights were sparser than the stars. Tonight the clock read 8:47. He had not said anything yet. He'd simply stopped talking mid-sentence to the prospect beside him, the way a dog stops eating when it hears a car in the driveway that isn't the right car. Around him, the room kept its held breath a little longer than usual, and somewhere under the jukebox's silence, he felt the shape of something wrong settling into the room like cold air under a door. At 9:15, the door had still not opened. He set his beer down without finishing it, which the men who knew him understood as a kind of alarm bell, and reached for his keys. 9 years ago it had started the same way, though none of them knew that yet. A woman walking into a room full of leather and smoke, like she was walking into church, laying a folded 20 and a note on the bar, gone before the door swung shut behind her. That first December, they'd laughed about it, half drunk and unbothered, some old widow who'd wandered in by mistake. By the 3rd December, no one laughed. By the 6th, men who'd never said a prayer in their lives found themselves quiet for a full minute after she left, staring at the door like it might open again and explain something. It never did. Now the sergeant-at-arms stood in the gravel lot with his keys already cold in his palm, breath fogging under a security light that buzzed like it was thinking about dying too. 63 men behind him in that clubhouse, and not one of them had said out loud what he was thinking, though he could feel it moving through the room, the way weather moves through a valley before you see it, pressure first, then the actual storm. He'd noticed her the second year, really noticed her, the way you notice a scar on someone's hand before you know the story behind it. She never made eye contact. She counted bills like she was counting something else, days maybe, or names. Her hands shook, but her handwriting never did. He'd once tried to follow her out, just to hold the door, just to say, "Thank you, ma'am." And she'd already been 3 car lengths down the road, taillights small and steady in the dark like she'd done this 100 times and knew exactly how long the courtesy of strangers usually lasted. He climbed into his truck. The old delivery receipt was still in the glove box where it had sat for 2 years, a name he'd copied off a firewood invoice out of nothing but habit, the same habit that made him check locks twice and count exits in every room he entered. Habits from a war he didn't talk about, a war that had taught him the exact weight of a silence that meant something had already gone wrong before anyone said so. The road past the county line was the kind that ate headlights, no shoulder, no signs, just dark and more dark, and the occasional reflector blinking back at him like an eye. He drove it slower than he needed to, the way a man drives when part of him is hoping the destination will change its mind. Above him, the sky had gone the flat, hard black of a Kansas December. No clouds, no moon, just cold enough to make the truck's heater tick and groan. He didn't know yet what he was driving toward. He only knew that for 9 years a woman had never once been late, and tonight she was. 9 years ago, the first time she'd walked through that door, nobody had known her name either. She'd come in on a wind so sharp it had cracked a beer sign clean off its chain outside, stamped the snow from a pair of boots too thin for the season, and set an envelope on the bar without a word. The bartender that night, long gone now, moved to Tulsa, had assumed she was lost. She wasn't. She'd counted heads, 63 of them, paid for every drink in the room, and left before the first man could turn around to ask her name. That had been the beginning. Nobody had marked it as anything but strange until the 2nd December, when she came again, same night, same silence, same folded note in the same neat hand. By the 3rd year it had a name among them, though none of them said it out loud. The widow's night. By the 9th, it had become something closer to scripture. The truck's headlights found the turnoff before he expected it, a mailbox leaning sideways at the end of a gravel drive gone soft with old snow. No lights on in the house, no lights on the porch either, which struck him as wrong before he could say why. She always left the porch light burning, every year, every visit he'd ever made near that road for firewood or parts, the bulb glowing yellow through the frost like a small stubborn flag. Tonight there was only the shape of the house against the flatter dark of the field behind it, and the mailbox door hanging open, stuffed past its hinge with envelopes gone soft with damp. He put the truck in park without deciding to. Some part of him, the part trained by things he never spoke about, was already counting. The number of steps to the door, the absence of tire tracks in the drive, the fact that no dog barked, though he didn't know if she kept one. He'd never been inside. He'd never even seen her up close except for that one impossible half-second every December when she brushed past him toward the door, gone before his mouth could form thank you. He knocked. The sound came back at him flat, absorbed by the cold instead of the house. He knocked again, harder, and something in his chest went tight and small, the way it had years ago in another country, in another kind of silence, right before he learned what silence like that usually meant. The window beside the door was dark glass reflecting his own face back at him, older than he liked to admit, and behind that reflection, faint, unmoving, the outline of a chair. He tried the door, locked, the knob cold enough to sting his palm even through the callus built over 20 years of clutch levers and cold mornings, and he stood there a moment, listening to his own breath fog and vanish, the only movement in a yard gone still as a photograph. 9 winters back, the first time she'd come, she hadn't looked like someone carrying a debt. She'd looked like any old woman stepping in out of weather, snow melting off a wool coat too thin for the season, a purse held against her chest with both hands like it might be taken from her. She'd walked straight to the bar, said 4 words to the man pouring drinks, whatever they're owed, and set an envelope on the counter before anyone thought to ask her name. By the time the bartender looked up from counting the bills inside, she was already through the door, taillights of a station wagon sliding off into the dark toward the highway. He remembered thinking, back then, that grief had a particular walk. He hadn't known yet it was grief he was watching. He'd only clocked it the way he clocked everything, filed it, set it aside, told himself it wasn't his business. Now he circled the house, boots breaking through a crust of old snow gone gray with cinders, and found a side window with the latch turned wrong, painted over so many times it hadn't fully caught in years. He worked his fingers under the frame the way he used to work them under a jammed rifle bolt, patient, unhurried, the cold biting through his knuckles. The window gave with a small dry shriek that felt too loud for the dead quiet of the field behind the house. He didn't call out yet. There was a rule to this, learned the hard way, that you didn't announce yourself into a silence until you understood what kind of silence it was. Inside smelled of wood smoke long since gone cold, and lemon polish, and something sweeter underneath that he didn't let himself name. A hallway. A row of coats on hooks, one of them the wool one, dry now, hung the way a person hangs a coat when they mean to wear it again tomorrow. His flashlight found a low table crowded with photographs, dozens of them, silver frames gone dull with fingerprints in the same 3 or 4 spots, worn down from being touched. He stepped closer. A young man's face looked back at him from every frame, leather jacket, one boot up on a chrome foot peg, a grin aimed at whoever held the camera, a grin that belonged, unmistakably, impossibly, to someone who had ridden. Behind him, through the doorway to the front room, the outline of the chair he'd seen from outside sat exactly where it had been for however long it had been sitting there, and this time, when he made himself look, he saw that it was not empty. The chair did not move. He noticed that first, the way a man notices the absence of a sound before he notices the sound itself. Her hands rested in her lap, folded the way you fold hands for a photograph, and her chin had dropped forward as though she had been listening to something low and had simply stopped listening. He did not go closer yet. There is a distance a man keeps from certain kinds of stillness, a courtesy older than any training he'd had, in the sandbox or out of it. 9 years earlier, a woman in a gray coat had stood in the clubhouse doorway on a Tuesday in December, snow catching in her hair, and asked the bartender in a voice too steady for what she was about to do, whether tonight's tab was closed yet. It was not. She said, "Then don't close it." She'd left before anyone learned her name, a folded bill under the register, a note in handwriting that slanted hard to the right like it was leaning into wind, "For the boys who bring my son home safe on the roads." No one that first year had thought to ask which son, which roads, because gratitude that specific rarely asks to be interrogated. It simply gets carried forward, the way a favor gets carried forward, one man buying the next man's coffee for no reason he could name. Now the flashlight beam found her face, and he made himself hold it there a half-second longer than instinct wanted, the way you check a pulse you already know isn't there. Her eyes were closed. Whatever had taken her had not been unkind about it, no twist of pain in the mouth, no clawed grip on the armrest, just an old woman who had sat down in her chair to wait for something and had stopped waiting sometime in the night, quietly, the way the porch bulb outside had stopped burning. He said her name once, not loud, not a question, just a word laid down like a hand on a shoulder, in case some last thread of her was still in the room to hear it. Then he stepped back into the hallway and made the call, his voice flatter than he wanted it to be, giving the address off the delivery slip he still had folded in his jacket pocket, the paper gone soft at the crease from being handled all night like a rosary. He did not go back to the front room while he waited. He went instead to the low table crowded with photographs, and he picked one up, the young man on the chrome footpeg, grinning at whoever held the camera, and he turned it over, the way you turn over a card you're afraid to look at, hoping the back will explain the front. There was writing there too, small, dated, a year that put the photograph decades before any of them had first pulled into that gravel lot on a December night, looking for nothing more than a warm bar and a cold beer. Danny, Route 9, summer. That was all. 4 words and a year that made him do the math twice, standing there in a dead woman's front room, with sirens still 10 minutes out. 34 years. He set the photograph down exactly where it had been, squared it against the dust line it left behind, because some part of him understood already that this room was not to be disturbed, that whatever else happened tonight, nobody was going to come through here with careless hands. He went back to the armchair. He made himself look at her properly this time, the way you make yourself look at a wreck on the highway because looking away doesn't undo it. She looked asleep. That was the mercy in it, if there was one. Hands folded, chin low, a quilt pulled to her knees like she'd meant to nap and simply hadn't woken up from it. 34 years earlier, on a stretch of Route 9 that didn't have a name yet worth remembering, 2 boys not yet patched, not yet anything, pulled their bikes onto the shoulder because a car had gone into the ditch and there was a shape moving in the wreckage that shouldn't have still been moving. They were 19. Neither of them carried a phone that worked out that far. One of them held the boy's hand, Danny's hand, though they didn't know that name yet, and kept saying the kind of nothing you say to someone who is leaving, the kind of nothing that isn't for the dying, it's for the ones left standing. He didn't make it. They stayed until the ambulance did, and then they rode on, because that's what boys with no patches and no names did back then. They didn't wait to be thanked. They didn't leave a card. They rode into the dark and never spoke of it again, and eventually they got their patches, and eventually they were old men, and eventually they forgot the mile marker. Ruth never forgot it. A stranger at the hospital had mentioned 2 riders, no colors yet, kids really, who'd stayed with him. She spent 9 years trying to find them in the only place she could think to look, a clubhouse bar in Black Ridge, the closest thing to a chapter house for boys who rode that road. She never found the exact 2. She found 63 instead, and decided, in the quiet arithmetic of grief, that it didn't matter which hands had held her sons. The debt belonged to all of them now. Cole did not know any of this yet, standing in that room, with the photograph's dust shadow still fresh under his eyes. He only knew a date, a road, and a silence that had lasted 9 winters longer than it should have. Outside, far off, a siren finally turned onto the street. The siren grew louder, then swallowed itself in the driveway, red light sweeping the porch in slow, indifferent arcs. He stepped outside to meet it because someone had to, because that was what the vest meant, whether the moment called for violence or grief. 2 paramedics went in first. He stood on the walk with his hands loose at his sides, the way he'd stood outside a dozen doors overseas, waiting on news that would rearrange a day. 34 years earlier, on a stretch of 2-lane blacktop 14 miles east of town, a boy of 19 had lost a rear tire on a curve nobody respected enough to slow for, and had gone down hard enough that the bike stopped being a bike. 2 riders, no patches yet, no names that mattered to history, had come around that same curve 11 minutes later, headlights catching chrome scattered like teeth across the shoulder. They hadn't known him. They'd known only that a man was dying alone under a sky going the color of a fresh bruise, and that no one should have to do that without another human voice nearby. They stayed until the ambulance came. They gave a report to a deputy who didn't write down their names correctly, or at all. They rode away that night and never mentioned it again, not to each other, not to anyone, the way certain kindnesses get folded up small and put in a pocket a man forgets he's wearing. Ruth had not been on the road that night. She'd been at home, a pot roast going cold on the stove, waiting for a boy who was already gone. She learned the rest secondhand. A nurse's aside, a stranger's mention of riders, no colors, kids really, and she had built 9 winters of pilgrimage on that one overheard fragment. Inside the house now, a paramedic's voice came low and procedural through the screen door, the tone men use when there's no urgency left to serve. Cole did not go in. He stood on the step where a boy's mother must have stood, counting headlights on worse nights than this one, and he understood, finally, in the dumb, blunt way understanding arrives too late, why an old woman would spend a decade thanking 63 strangers for a debt none of them remembered opening. He thought of the ledger tucked in his jacket. He thought of 9 years of unsent letters folded like small closed doors. He thought that somewhere in this town, in some other town, 2 men who used to be boys were going about their evening not knowing they were owed anything at all. The porch light socket above him held nothing but a dead bulb and a scatter of dried moths. He looked at it a long moment, as if it might still explain something. Behind him, the screen door opened. The paramedic who stepped out was young enough that his hands still shook a little around the clipboard, and he said the words a man learns to say without weight, passed in her sleep, no signs of struggle, looks like hours ago, maybe more, and Cole nodded at each one like a man taking inventory of a wound he'd already guessed the size of. He asked if she'd been alone. The paramedic said the neighbor found her in the chair by the window, facing the road, like she'd been waiting on something that never came up the drive. Cole didn't say what he was thinking, that she had been waiting on someone for 34 years and simply ran out of nights. The road bends hard 3 miles north of the county line, banked wrong for the speed limit posted, and on a July night that same year, decades back now, though the asphalt hasn't changed and neither has the ditch, Two boys on borrowed bikes, no patches, no colors, barely old enough to buy the gas they were burning, came around that curve behind a scream of brakes that wasn't theirs. They found the car folded into the guardrail like foil, and the driver's door already open, and a young man half out of it, breathing wrong, moonlight doing nothing kind to what the windshield had done to him. They didn't have a radio worth trusting that far out. One of them ran the half-mile to the gas station payphone, the other stayed. He stayed the whole time, didn't touch him beyond a hand on the shoulder, didn't pretend to know anything about dying except that a person shouldn't do it looking at nothing. He talked about nothing in particular. His own bike, a girl he liked, the heat. The way you talk to someone you're trying to keep tethered to the world a little longer than the world intends. When the young man's eyes went somewhere else, the boy was still talking. He never gave his name to the mother who arrived 40 minutes later in a nightgown and boots, sobbing into a deputy's shoulder. He didn't think there was a name worth giving. He'd only done what anyone would. He rode off that night and never wore a patch, never joined a club, told the story to almost no one, and the version that survived, riders, no colors, kids really, traveled through a nurse's break room and a hospital hallway, and finally into the ear of a widow who took it and built a cathedral out of it, brick by brick, winter by winter, for 9 years running. Cole stood on the porch with that unlit bulb behind him, and the paramedic's clipboard voice fading into procedure, and somewhere behind his sternum, a shape was assembling itself out of scraps he didn't yet have all of, a name he didn't have, a road he was starting to recognize, a debt with no ledger entry wide enough to hold it. The paramedic's radio crackled twice and went quiet. Cole didn't move. He'd learned a long time ago that a body in shock will hold a pose for you, will let you stand there like a fence post while the world reorganizes itself around a fact too large to carry standing up. 34 years. He did the math without meaning to, the way you check a wound before you feel the pain of it. 34 years since a boy died on a road the club now rode twice a week, lights out, looking for exactly the kind of trouble that boy had been in. Nobody had ever told him which mile marker. He thought about that stretch past the Coleridge cutoff, where the guardrail had been replaced so many times it didn't match itself, silver patches on rust like a quilt nobody planned. He thought about the times he'd stopped there himself, engine ticking as it cooled, for no reason he could name except that something in him always slowed down at that bend, the way a dog slows at a door it doesn't remember why it fears. Inside the house, the shrine went on being a shrine. A boy who would always be 19 sat forever behind glass, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. Cole hadn't looked long. Some things you don't stare at twice in one night, not out of squeamishness, but out of respect. The same instinct that makes a man take his hat off in a doorway he doesn't remember being taught to honor. The younger deputy came out, notebook in hand, the kind of notebook that would end up filed and forgotten in a drawer 3 counties over. He said the word unattended and the word natural in the same breath, like he was trying to make a sentence gentler by shrinking it. Cole nodded because nodding was the only tool he had left that wouldn't break something on the way out of him. He looked back through the screen door once more before he left. The letters were still stacked on the counter where they'd found them, 9 of them, waiting for envelopes that had never been licked. Somebody would have to read them. He didn't know yet that it would be him, standing at a podium built out of a folding table and a borrowed microphone, his hands shaking in a way 30 years of highway had never managed to produce. He walked to his bike slow, the way a man walks out of a church he wasn't raised in but suddenly owes something to. The engine caught on the first kick. He didn't gun it. He let it idle, listening to it the way he hadn't listened to an engine in years, like it might tell him something if he was patient enough. Behind him, the porch light socket sat black and empty, and somewhere past the tree line, the sky was doing that thing December skies do before snow, holding its breath. The past came back to him on the ride down the county road, the way it always did when his hands had nothing else to hold on to but rubber grips and cold air. 31 years old that winter, a prospect's cut on his back instead of a patch, the leather still stiff, still smelling like a shop instead of a life. He hadn't earned anything yet. He'd been nothing but a kid with a bike and a debt to pay off in miles. The stretch of highway had been the same one. He knew that now, the way a man knows a scar is his even after the skin forgets the cut. Two riders ahead of him that night, older men long since gone to other clubs or other towns or the ground. A car in the ditch, its hazards blinking like a slow heartbeat, snow starting to lay itself down soft and final over the wreckage. He remembered the boy's hand had been warm when he first took it. That was the detail nobody wanted, the one that didn't fit into eulogies. Warm hands don't belong to dying. But the boy's breathing had already gone thin and wrong, and one of the older riders had said, "Quiet, not for the boy to hear." Ambulance is 20 out, at least. 20 minutes is a long time to hold a stranger's hand in the snow. He hadn't known the boy's name. Nobody had asked for it, and by the time it would have mattered to ask, the boy wasn't answering anything. They'd stayed anyway. Some decisions don't announce themselves as decisions, they just happen. The way staying happened. The way three men in leather knelt in slush because leaving felt like a thing none of them could carry afterward. He hadn't thought about it again in years. Wasn't even sure he'd have called it a memory before tonight. It had lived somewhere lower than memory, in the part of him that still braked a little harder past that mile marker without knowing why. He came up now on the marker itself, the reflective sign catching his headlight and throwing it back white and sudden. He didn't slow. He didn't need to. His body already knew where it was. He thought about the letters again, waiting on her counter like 9 mouths that had never gotten to speak. He thought about a boy's warm hand. He thought, and this was the part that finally cracked something loose in his chest, right there at 60 miles an hour with the wind trying to take it from him before he could finish the thought, that he had never once, in 9 years of free whiskey and a stranger's quiet gratitude, wondered why she'd chosen his bar, his club, his 63 men. Now he knew. Now he had to ride home and say it out loud to people who didn't yet know they were the ones being thanked. The clubhouse lights were still on when he pulled in, gravel popping under his tires the way it always did, though tonight the sound felt too loud, like the world had gone quiet everywhere else just to let him hear it. Bikes stood in their crooked rows, chrome catching the one working floodlight, and through the window he could see the shapes of the men who'd waited up without being asked to. Nobody had told them to stay. They'd stayed anyway. That was the kind of thing 9 years built without anyone noticing it was being built. He killed the engine and sat there a moment longer than he needed to, hands still curled around grips that weren't moving anymore, letting the quiet settle into him before he carried it inside. 34 years, he kept thinking. 34 years and a mile marker, and a boy's hand going cold in a stranger's palm. And somehow that thread had run all the way forward to a bar tab paid in silence every December, to a note that never once explained itself because maybe it didn't need to, not to the ones who'd been there, not even if they never knew they'd been there. The door stuck the way it always stuck, humidity swelling the wood, and when he pushed through, the talk in the room died the way it does when men read a face before they read the words coming out of it. Faces turned. Someone set a glass down without drinking from it. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway with the cold still coming off his jacket in a thin fog, and he said the only thing that felt true enough to carry the weight of it. "I know who her son was." Nobody moved. Somewhere behind the bar the old radio kept playing low, some station that hadn't changed its programming since before half these men were patched, and it felt wrong now, too easy, too ordinary for what was about to be said into a room that didn't yet know it was about to be rearranged. "Not his name," he said. "Not yet. But I know how he died. And I know some of you," his eyes moved over them, over faces he'd ridden beside for a decade without once asking what they carried underneath their jackets. Some of you were there, before patches, before any of this was a club worth thanking. A chair scraped somewhere in the back. Someone exhaled like they'd been holding it for years without knowing why. He thought of the letters again, waiting on a dead woman's counter, 9 winters of gratitude that had never found a mouth to speak it aloud, and he understood, standing there in the doorway with the cold still bleeding off him, that he was about to become the mouth for all of them, whether he was ready or not. "Somebody's going to want to sit down for this," he said. Nobody sat. Nobody sat, and so he told it standing, the way a man tells something he's afraid will collapse if he sits down inside it. 34 years back, on the stretch of two-lane that ran north out of Black Ridge toward the county line, a boy had gone off the shoulder on a wet October night, the kind of wet that comes sideways and doesn't announce itself, and by the time anyone found him, the bike was 30 feet from where he lay, and there was no ambulance for 11 miles in any direction. Two riders had come up on him first, not patched, not anything yet, just kids themselves, really, 19 and 21, riding hand-me-down machines with more rust than chrome, the kind of boys this club hadn't even existed to catch. They didn't leave him. That was the whole of what he knew, the whole of what the county records and a yellowed clipping from a newspaper that folded 20 years ago could tell him. They didn't leave him. They stayed on their knees on the wet asphalt with a stranger's son until the sound of him breathing stopped being a sound at all, and then they stayed a while longer after that, because someone had decided, without discussing it, that a boy shouldn't go alone into whatever came next. Nobody ever wrote down their names. The room had gone the particular kind of quiet that isn't absence of noise so much as the presence of something too large for noise. He watched three men near the pool table not look at each other, which told him more than if they'd spoken. He watched a fourth, gray-bearded, hands like a man who'd worked a forge his whole life, set his beer down slow and careful, like the bottle itself might shatter from what was being said around it. She never knew who, he said. She spent 9 winters paying a debt to a patch that didn't exist yet when her boy died. She was thanking ghosts, or she was thanking us for being close enough to the ghosts that it didn't matter. He thought of the note, the same handwriting 9 years running, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. For the boys who bring my son home safe on the roads. Not the boys who'd saved him, the boys who'd simply, stubbornly, refused to let him die unaccompanied. He looked at the gray-bearded man by the pool table, who still hadn't lifted his eyes. "You were on that road in October, 34 years back," he said. It wasn't a question. The radio kept playing behind the bar, some song about leaving that nobody in the room was listening to anymore, and outside the wind pushed against the windows like it wanted in on what was happening, and the gray-bearded man finally looked up, and what was on his face wasn't grief exactly. It was recognition, the kind that had been waiting 34 years for someone to finally ask. His name back then was nothing, just a kid with a permit patch sewn crooked on a jacket 2 sizes too big, riding a bike he'd bought with cash from a summer of roofing work. He said this without preamble, the way men say things they've rehearsed in the dark for decades and never once said aloud. October, he said, cold enough that his hands had gone stiff on the grips. He and 2 others, boys really, not yet initiated, not yet anything, had been riding the long stretch past the county line when they saw the truck folded into the guardrail like a beer can, and a motorcycle further off in the ditch grass, its front wheel still spinning. The room had gone so quiet that the wind against the windows sounded like a third voice in the conversation. He didn't perform the memory. He laid it down flat, like a man setting a tool on a bench. The boy in the ditch had been maybe 19. Broken in ways that didn't need a doctor to diagnose. No phone reception out there in '89, not for another 20 minutes ride to the nearest line, and one of the others had gone for help while he and the third stayed. Sat down in that grass. Talked to a stranger about nothing, trucks, girls, whether the Cardinals would ever win another one, because the boy's eyes kept sliding somewhere far off and it seemed important, urgently important, to keep pulling them back. "He asked me not to leave," the gray-bearded man said. "So, I didn't." He said, the boy stopped answering somewhere near the end, but he kept talking anyway, in case some part of him could still hear it. He said when the ambulance came, it was already too late to matter for anything but the paperwork. He said he never gave his name to anyone, not the medics, not the family if there'd been a service, because at 19, he hadn't understood yet that a mother might spend the rest of her life needing to know it. "I didn't even know his name," he said, "not till I saw the obituary 2 days later, Callahan." Cole felt the floor of the evening shift under that single word, the way ice does before it goes, a sound more than a feeling. Nobody spoke. The bartender had stopped wiping the counter mid-motion. Somewhere behind them, a pool ball dropped into a pocket with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had written. You never told anyone, Cole said. Told my old lady. Told God a few times. Drunk. He looked down at his hands, thick-knuckled now, spotted, nothing like the hands of the boy who'd sat in that ditch. Never told a Callahan. Didn't know there was one left to tell. Cole thought of the porch light, dead and unremarked, and the stack of letters folded soft as cloth, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man finally seeing the whole shape of a thing he'd only ever seen pieces of, that the debt in this room ran both directions, and had for 34 years, and neither side had known the other was paying it. The old writer's mouth worked once before any sound came out of it. There were 3 of us, he said, younger than dumb, didn't even have colors yet, prospects, patches still wet ink in somebody's head. He said it like a confession he'd rehearsed in the dark for 3 decades and never once said aloud to a living ear. Cole didn't move. Nobody in the room moved. The furnace ticked somewhere in the walls, counting seconds nobody was using for anything but listening. 34 years peeled back like a strip of old paint. A stretch of 2-lane blacktop, no shoulder to speak of, October dusk coming down gray and cold with the smell of wet asphalt and diesel. A boy, 19, maybe 20, thrown clear of a bike that had folded itself around a guardrail like a hand closing into a fist. 3 younger men on borrowed motorcycles, engines still ticking hot behind them, standing over him in a ditch full of dead grass because there was nothing else to do and no ambulance for 11 miles. He wasn't scared, the old writer said. That's the part I never told anybody. Kid's dying and he's not scared. Kept asking if the bike was bad hurt, like the bike mattered. His jaw worked. We told him it'd be fine. Told him a lot of things that weren't true. Held his hand. 3 grown men, or trying to be, held his hand like it was nothing, like we did it every day. Somewhere in the present, a beer went warm and untouched on the bar. How long? Cole said. His voice came out lower than he meant it to. 20 minutes. 40. I don't know. Long enough the light changed twice. He looked at his own hands again, like they belonged to somebody he used to know. He went quiet, and that was worse than the yelling. Then he just wasn't there anymore. Same body, different thing. A breath. We waited with him till the county truck came. Didn't leave. Didn't think about leaving. Never thought about it as something anybody'd need thanking for. Nobody in the bar corrected him. Nobody said anything for the better part of a minute, and in that minute Cole understood the note in the drawer at home differently than he had an hour before. For the boys who bring my son home safe on the roads. Not a wish, not a hope thrown blind into a bar full of strangers every December, but a debt paid forward to men who'd never know they were the ones being repaid. Riders 3 decades younger than the ones drinking that beer. Riders who were dead now themselves, or gray, and sitting 3 stools down, not knowing it either. The old rider looked up, finally, eyes wet and unashamed of it. She never got a name, he said. I could have given her one. Could have walked up any of them 9 years and just said it. His hand closed slow around nothing. Didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I wanted something for it. Cole thought of 63 men in that room not moving, and somewhere across town a porch light nobody had fixed yet, and a stack of letters folded soft as cloth waiting to be read out loud to the very people they'd been written for. He didn't ask the old writer's name either. Some debts stay unsigned on purpose. 34 years back, on a stretch of 2-lane blacktop nobody bothered to name on a map, a boy on a borrowed Triumph had gone down hard just past the mile marker where the guardrail still bends wrong to this day. 2 riders, 19, 20, patchless, riding home from nothing in particular, had seen the skid marks before they saw the bike. They hadn't called themselves a club. They'd just stopped. He pictured it now the way the old man had told it in pieces, not looking at anyone, the boy's leg bent underneath him in a way legs don't bend, the smell of gasoline and hot asphalt, the 2 of them taking turns holding his hand because someone had said, somewhere, sometime, that a person shouldn't die without a hand in theirs. 40 minutes for the ambulance. 40 minutes of nothing but wind through wheat fields and a boy asking, near the end, if it was going to hurt much longer. They told him no. They were lying. They didn't know. But it was the only mercy they had to give, so they gave it. Back in the present, 63 men sat in a room gone the color of held breath, and somewhere across town the porch light stayed dark over a mailbox nobody had emptied, and neither of these facts had anything to do with each other yet, except that they were about to. He stood. Chair legs scraped concrete like something tearing. "We're going back," he said. "Now." Nobody asked back where. The old rider's eyes followed him to the door, and in them was something that hadn't been there a minute ago. Not grief exactly, something closer to relief. The particular relief of a weight set down after 30 years of carrying it without knowing its shape. Outside, the cold had teeth in it, the kind of cold that made engines cough before they caught, and he swung his leg over steel gone stiff with frost and didn't wait to see who followed. He heard them anyway, the whole lot of that room emptying into the lot behind him, boots on gravel, zippers, the low percussion of 60-some machines waking up one after another like something coming back to life that had no business dying in the first place. He thought about a boy on his back in a wheat field 34 years ago, asking a stranger if it would hurt much longer, and a woman years later standing at a bar with a folded note in her coat pocket, unable to say thank you to men who didn't exist anymore in any form she could find, so she said it to the only version of them still breathing, a jacket, a patch, a room full of strangers who happened to ride the same roads her son had died on. The porch light was 3 miles off now. He opened the throttle like the miles owed him something. The road unspooled black and glazed under his headlight, and behind him the column of taillights stretched red into the dark like something bleeding backward. He kept his eyes on the shoulder, on the ditches, on the places a body might end up if a body needed finding, because that was the shape his mind gave to fear when it didn't want to call it fear. 34 years fell away from him the way the mile markers did. Fast, then slower. Fast, then slower. The past and the present running the same stretch of asphalt at different speeds. He remembered. No, he had been told, and the telling had lodged in him like something remembered. A field in late October, frost already silvering the wheat stubble, and 2 boys on a borrowed bike who hadn't earned patches yet, who were nothing then, nobody, kids playing at being outlaws. He didn't know their names. Nobody living did. They'd stopped because a taillight was blinking wrong in a ditch, because that was what you did before you were anybody, before the world taught you it was safer not to stop. He didn't know if the boy had said it would hurt much longer, or if that was just the shape grief had given the story after enough winters of retelling. But he knew a woman had believed it happened that way, and had built 9 years of Decembers around the belief, and now her porch light was somewhere ahead of him, dark. The wind came in under his collar like a hand feeling for a pulse. He didn't slow for it. Behind him the pack held formation without needing to be told. 60-some machines reading each other's throttle the way herd animals read weather, an old language none of them had to learn twice. He thought of the note, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, sitting in an evidence bag on his passenger seat like it weighed something, for the boys who bring my son home safe on the roads. He'd read it forward and backward until the words stopped being words and became just shapes he recognized the way he recognized his own hands. A green sign flashed past. 3 miles became 2, and he felt the whole line behind him lean into the turn without a light being touched, without a word passing. That was the thing nobody outside the life understood. How much could be said with no one saying anything? How a formation of engines could hold more feeling than a church full of talking. He came around the last curve and saw the porch, dark against the tree line, no light in the window, no shape moving behind the glass, and something in his chest dropped a full floor before his mind caught up to why. He killed the engine at the base of the drive, and the silence that followed was worse than any noise the bikes had made. 60-some machines ticking as they cooled. A chorus of small metal sounds like the world exhaling. Behind him, the others were dismounting slow, the way men move when they already know something and are only waiting for permission to say it out loud. Nobody said it out loud. He walked up first because that was his job, had been his job for 11 years, walking into rooms before anyone else, so that whatever waited there met him and not the ones behind him. His boots found the porch steps he'd never climbed before, but somehow already knew. 3rd step canted left, boards soft with rot at the edges, a welcome mat worn down to its threads. The porch light fixture hung dark above the door, glass clouded with dead moths, and when he reached up on reflex to check the bulb, his fingers found it loose in the socket, not broken, just spent, just an old filament that had finally given up holding light after however many thousand nights of trying. The door was unlocked. He noticed that before anything else, that a woman who lived alone at the end of a gravel road hadn't locked her door, and something about the ease of the handle turning under his palm felt like an answer arriving before the question had finished being asked. Cold air breathed out at him from the dark hallway, colder than the December night behind him, the particular cold of a house where no one had adjusted a thermostat in some time. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust, the way he'd learned to in another life, another decade, in rooms where light meant danger and darkness meant you had a chance to see first. Behind him he heard boots on gravel, low voices going quiet one by one as the others read his stillness the way they'd read the road all night. Someone said his name once, low, a question. He didn't answer it. He was looking at the shape in the front room, past the hallway, past a coat rack holding a single coat too small for a grown man's shoulders, a shape settled deep in an armchair angled toward a window that faced the road, faced it the way a person sits when they've spent years watching for headlights that never quite turn in. He took one step into the house. The floor creaked under his weight the way old floors do, announcing him to a room that didn't answer back, and he understood before he crossed the remaining distance, before his hand found the lamp switch, before the yellow light spilled over the chair, and the folded hands and the stillness that had nothing left of waiting in it. He understood the way he'd understood the porch light, the way he'd understood the note in the evidence bag on his seat. Some things told you the truth before you were ready to hear it. He crossed the room anyway, because a man doesn't leave a woman alone in a chair even when there's nothing left to do for her. Her hands were folded the way they'd be folded for a photograph, one over the other, resting on a Bible closed around a ribbon marker gone soft with handling. Her chin had dropped toward her chest like sleep, and maybe it had been sleep at first, before it became the other thing. He touched two fingers to the side of her neck out of habit more than hope, the training in him checking what the rest of him already knew, and then he stood there with his hand still raised for a second longer than it needed to be, as if he could put the moment back the way it was before he'd walked in. Outside, engines ticked as they cooled. Nobody gunned a throttle to fill the silence. That was its own kind of respect, learned the same place the rest of it had been learned. Funerals for brothers, roadside crosses, the particular quiet that follows a thing that can't be undone. He called it in himself, voice flat, giving the address twice, because the dispatcher asked twice, and then he stood in the doorway between the front room and the hall so no one else would walk in on her before someone official said it was time. Behind him, the coat rack held its one small coat. The window held the road. He found himself looking at the glass the way she must have looked at it 1,000 nights, waiting on headlights, and something in his chest folded the same way her hands were folded. A younger rider, barely 2 years patched, stood at the edge of the porch light's dead reach and asked, quiet, if she'd been alone when it happened. He said he didn't know. He said it like a man setting something down he wasn't ready to carry yet. The paramedics came without lights or siren, because there was no reason left to hurry, and that absence of urgency said more than the sirens would have. They moved through the house with the practiced gentleness of people who had done this before, for other people's mothers, other people's grandmothers, and Cole stood back and let them, watching the porch light bulb sit dead and ordinary in its socket, no scorch, no wiring fault, nothing but a filament that had simply reached the end of what filaments are given. He looked once more at the shrine down the hall, the photograph, the folded jacket, the years of candle wax, and understood the porch light going dark on the same night as everything else wasn't a mystery. It was just an old house, keeping time with an old woman, both of them finally letting go. 34 years ago, on a stretch of 2-lane blacktop 11 miles east of Black Ridge, a boy on a Kawasaki had gone down on black ice at 2:14 in the morning, and the county coroner's report, which Cole would not read for another 6 days, would not be able to make himself read until the funeral was already planned, recorded the time of death as unknown, bracketed, because no one could say for certain when he'd stopped breathing versus when someone had simply confirmed it. Two boys on borrowed bikes, unpatched, 19 and 20, had been riding home from a bar in Tilden that no longer existed under that name. They'd seen the taillight down in the ditch grass before they'd seen the wreck. They hadn't had a phone that worked out that far. They'd done the only thing there was to do, which was stay. One of them had held the dying boy's hand until the ambulance found the turnoff. 40 minutes that would have been unbearable alone, and were, according to no witness who ever spoke of it, unbearable together either. Just quiet and cold, and someone's grip not loosening. None of that was in any file Cole had access to. None of it was in the shrine down the hall, not directly, only in the space around it. The space a mother leaves when she's decided some kinds of gratitude don't need a name attached, only a place to be delivered, year after year, until the delivering itself became the only shape her grief was allowed to take in public. Cole didn't know any of this yet, standing on the porch while the paramedics carried a woman he'd known for 9 Decembers out to a vehicle that wasn't in any hurry. He knew only what the house had told him, which was less than half of it, and he stood there, working the rest out the way a man works out a debt from an unlabeled ledger, by feel, by weight, by what's missing. The younger rider came up beside him again, hands jammed in his jacket pockets against the cold that had settled deeper now that the porch light's small warmth had gone dark for good. "We're going to have to figure out who she was," he said. Not a question. Cole nodded, once, and looked back down the hall toward the photograph on the wall, the boy's face frozen at an age he'd never get older than, and felt the first thread of it pull loose. Not an answer yet, just the sense that somewhere in this house was the whole shape of what 9 years of tabs had actually been paying for. The desk in the back bedroom was the kind furniture stores stopped making 40 years ago, oak gone the color of strong tea, and its top drawer stuck when he pulled it, swollen with age and damp Ohio winters. He worked it loose with the flat of his palm, the way he'd worked loose 1,000 stuck bolts, patient, unhurried, and it gave all at once and nearly spilled its contents onto the floor. Papers, a stack of them, rubber-banded, the band gone brittle and cracking under his fingers. 9 envelopes, 9, exactly, and he knew, before he counted them, that the number would matter, because nothing in this house had been careless yet. Each one addressed in the same careful hand that had written the notes he'd found on 63 bar tabs over the years. Black Ridge Motorcycle Club, 4th Street, care of whoever's tending bar. Never a name on the envelope either, same as the notes. Some habits don't loosen even when the reason for them does. None of them stamped, none of them sent. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed because his knees told him to, and slid a thumb under the flap of the top envelope, the one with a date in the corner 9 years old, and stopped himself before he opened it. Not here, not alone, standing in a dead woman's bedroom with the ambulance lights still bruising the window red and blue. The younger rider was in the doorway again, always in doorways tonight, like he didn't trust himself past thresholds in a house not his own. "What is it?" the kid said, and it wasn't really a question either. "Letters," Cole said. "She wrote us letters." "For how long?" "Every year. Looks like." He turned the stack over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. 9 winters compressed into paper and ink, and a habit of restraint that must have cost her something every December to keep. Never sent one. The kid didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything easy to say. Outside, a car door shut with the soft finality of a job already finished, and somewhere down the hall, a paramedic's radio crackled low. Business as usual, another welfare check that ended, the way most of them do eventually. Cole set the letters on his knee and looked at the top one a long moment, at the handwriting that had gotten smaller and more careful with each passing year, like she'd been rationing the ink, or rationing herself. "We're not opening these here," he said, standing, gathering them against his chest, like something that could still be hurt by rough handling. "We're taking them home. All 63 of us are going to hear these together." He didn't know yet what was in them. He only knew, the way he'd known all along without letting himself know it, that whatever they said would finally tell him who the boy in the photograph had been to her, and to a debt none of them remembered owing. The clubhouse had never been quiet like this before. Not on a fight night, not on a funeral night, Not even the year one of their own had gone into the ground with full patches and a 21-gun send-off from men who didn't own guns for ceremony. 63 of them filled the main room shoulder to shoulder, boots planted on concrete that still smelled faintly of last week's cigarette smoke and this week's coffee, and nobody spoke while the sergeant-at-arms laid the letters out across the pool table in the order the dates climbed, 9 winters stacked in a single pale row. He read the first one himself, voice low and even, the kind of even that costs a man something to hold. Thank you for the warmth in a place that gets so cold. You don't know what you gave back to me. That was all. No name, no explanation, just gratitude offered into a room she never let herself enter long enough to receive an answer. The second was longer. The third longer still, the handwriting steadying the further back he went, like she'd been braver in the early years, before the weight of unspoken things had worn down even her nerve. A patched rider near the door, a man who'd buried 2 brothers in the club and never once let his face move when he did it, had to look at the ceiling for a while. Nobody said anything about that either. By the 5th letter, a name started surfacing in fragments. Not the club's, not any of theirs, but a boy's, mentioned like a held breath. He would have been proud of the coats you handed out that year. No one at that table knew what coats she meant, what winter, what stretch of dark highway it had happened on. The details lived only in her, and she was 2 rooms and 1 impossible silence away from ever explaining them. The sergeant-at-arms set the 5th letter down and looked at the stack still waiting, 4 more years of restraint folded into paper, and understood with the flat certainty of a man who has learned not to argue with facts, that the answer to who she'd been thanking them for was going to arrive whether the room was ready or not. He picked up the 6th. Outside, past the cracked windows and the gravel lot gone silver under a moon too bright for the cold it hung over, the wind moved through the flagpole chain in a slow, patient rhythm, like something keeping time, until the room caught up to what it already knew. The 6th letter answered what the 5th had only gestured toward. I still don't know your names. I have looked for them for 34 years and found only the shape of what you did, which I suppose will have to be enough. The sergeant-at-arms read it twice, then a third time, slower, the way a man rereads a diagnosis hoping the second pass will say something different. 34 years put the highway back before any of them had a cut on their back, before the clubhouse had a roof that didn't leak, before half the men in that room had learned to ride at all. He thought of the stretch of road they patrolled every winter, without ever asking why they'd started, the long black curve past the county line, where the guardrail had been replaced twice, and the shoulder dropped off soft into frozen grass. Riders had died there before the state finally widened it. Everyone in the club knew that the way they knew the weather, without needing the history explained. Nobody in the room that night had been born into patches yet. That was the arithmetic sitting under the letter like a current. Somewhere in a version of that same December, decades back, 2 boys not yet 20, and not yet sworn to anything, had been riding home on unpatched bikes borrowed from older cousins, engines too loud for the cold, when they came up on a wreck already gone still. A boy pinned in the wreckage of a car that had gone off that same soft shoulder. No ambulance for 11 more minutes. No streetlight for a mile in either direction. Just 2 kids in thin jackets kneeling in the frost, one of them holding a stranger's hand and saying his own name over and over so the boy would have something to hold on to besides the pain. Staying, because leaving felt like something neither of them could carry afterward. They never gave a last name. They rode off before the sheriff's car arrived, scared of trouble that wasn't theirs to explain, and never spoke of it again to anyone who might have written it down. The mother had asked for months afterward. The hospital gave her nothing. The sheriff gave her nothing. All she had, in the end, was her son's last hour handed back to her second hand, described by a nurse who'd only caught the tail of it. 2 young men, work boots, a jacket with an eagle stitched crooked on the shoulder, gone before she could learn a single name to thank. She had spent 9 winters paying a bar tab for 63 strangers, because somewhere among them, she believed, might be the grown shadow of a boy who once knelt in the frost and stayed. The sergeant-at-arms looked up from the 6th letter into a room that had gone entirely, uncomfortably still, and understood the 7th was going to name the coat. He unfolded the seventh letter the way a man unfolds something he already suspects will hurt him. The handwriting had thinned by this one, the ink lighter, as if the widow herself had grown tired of hoping anyone would read it. But the words held steady. A jacket with an eagle stitched crooked on the left shoulder. She'd written, "I never forgot that. I used to think if I looked at every jacket long enough, I'd find the stitching again." Nobody in the clubhouse moved. Somewhere behind the bar, the old refrigerator kicked on, a low mechanical hum, and it sounded, in that silence, like the whole building exhaling. 34 years back, on a shoulder of highway gone silver with frost, two boys not yet 20 had pulled their bikes onto the gravel because something in the wreck ahead didn't look like it could wait for sirens. Neither of them owned a patch yet. They were prospects then, unproven, riding jackets stitched by hand because the club hadn't trusted them with anything official. One eagle sewn crooked over the collarbone by a girlfriend who didn't know how to hold a needle straight, a joke between them that never got the chance to become a story. They knelt in that frost, holding a stranger's hand, and never told anyone what they'd seen. They didn't tell anyone because 18-year-olds don't know yet that the things they walk away from are the things that end up walking back. Cole set the letter down on the bar with the same care he'd have used setting down a bone that hadn't finished healing. "Anybody know who carried an eagle like that?" he said. His voice had gone somewhere low and careful, testing the floor of the room the way you test ice. Nobody answered right away. Then, from the back near the pool table, an old man who'd ridden with the club since before half the room had been born set his cue down against the felt. "My brother had a jacket like that," he said. "Stitched wrong on purpose. Said it made it his." The room turned toward him, the way a field turns toward weather. "He's not," Cole started. "Dead 11 years now," the old man said. "Heart, not the road." Something in Cole's chest loosened and tightened at the same time. Grief and relief tangled too close together to separate. "But he used to talk about it," the old man went on, quieter now. "A kid on the highway. Said he never told nobody the kid's name because he never asked it. Said it was the only regret he carried that never wore off." The refrigerator hummed. The letters sat in a stack that had gotten thinner all night and heavier with every page. Cole looked down at the eighth, unopened, and understood there was only one letter left to read, and that whatever it said, it wasn't going to let any of them leave this room the same. Cole opened the ninth letter. The handwriting had gone shakier than the others, the ink pressed harder, like her hand had known something the rest of her hadn't yet admitted. He read it aloud because that was the only way any of them could bear to hear it. "To the boys who stayed with him, I never learned your names and I have stopped needing to. What you gave him, you gave me too. 9 years, one night at a time, whether you knew it or not. Thank you for not letting my son be alone on that road. I have tried, every December, to not be alone either. I think I finally understand that I wasn't." No one spoke. Outside, the wind had died down to nothing. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm has said everything it meant to say. The old man by the pool table wiped his face with the back of his hand and didn't apologize for it. Cole folded the letter along its worn crease, the same crease it had been folded on for years, waiting. They buried her on a Tuesday in January, the ground hard enough that the diggers had to break it with a pick before the shovels could do their work. 63 motorcycles rode behind the hearse, engines low and even, no throttle theater, just the steady, constant sound of men who understood that some processions are a kind of prayer. Snow had started falling by the time they reached the cemetery, soft and unhurried, settling on leather and chrome alike without preference. They read all 9 letters aloud that night at the clubhouse, in order, and no one made a joke to cut the weight of it, because for once the weight was the whole point. The next December, and every December after, 63 riders, the number never dropped below it, and some years it grew, rode the 11 miles out to the cemetery on the 23rd, left notes weighted down with stones against the wind, and then rode the stretch of highway where a boy had died 34 years before anyone in that clubhouse had earned their patch. They stopped for strangers on the shoulder that night, changed tires, called tow trucks, sat with people so they wouldn't be alone, the way nameless boys once sat with a dying stranger, and never thought to mention it again. Cole rides past her house sometimes, on ordinary nights, no reason, no errand. The porch light is always on now. Someone from the club replaces the bulb before it has the chance to burn out. He has never told anyone why he does it. He doesn't need to. Some debts don't get repaid. They just get carried forward, headlight to headlight, until the road itself remembers them.